Silence has weight, and some souls carry the weight of a lifetime of unspoken words. What if a man lived to be 90, but a part of him died at 20 on a distant battlefield? What secret could seal a grandfather's lips for 70 years, only to be betrayed by his final breath? To his grandson, David, Samuel was a silent hero. But a single word, whispered on his deathbed, unraveled a family mystery that would rewrite their entire legacy. The journey to uncover the truth behind that name begins now, and the answer will change everything. Memory doesn't just live in the mind. It resides in the architecture of a house, in the stillness of its rooms, in the way the afternoon light lays across a worn hardwood floor. For David, crossing the threshold into his grandfather's now empty home was like entering a sanctuary dedicated to a silent deity. The air was thick, heavy not just with the scent of old books and wood polish, but with the palpable presence of 7 decades of silence. He moved through the space not as an heir, but as an archaeologist of emotion, his fingers tracing the outline of a velvet armchair where Samuel had sat for countless nights, staring at a point only he could see. Every object was a relic, a fragment of a story never told. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by the resounding echo of all that was left unsaid, a void that had become as solid and real as the walls that contained it. David felt that to honor the man, he first had to understand the silence that defined him, a silence that was both his fortress and his prison. The man who inhabited that silence was a figure of profound contrasts. Samuel was a pillar of the community, a man whose kindness was as reliable as the sunrise. He was the grandfather who taught his grandkids to fish, the husband who never forgot an anniversary, the neighbor who was always ready with a tool or a piece of advice. But beneath this surface of serene goodness, there was an undercurrent of melancholy, a distance that would manifest in the quietest moments. David remembered vividly as a child, sitting at his grandfather's feet, looking up at his weathered face and asking about the war medals he knew were tucked away somewhere. "Grandpa, tell me about the war." And Samuel, without breaking his gaze from the horizon, would just place a hand on his head and smile. But it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a curtain falling, a gentle but absolute deflection. He was a master of diverting attention away from his own pain, a love built on the foundation of a chasm he refused to let anyone see, let alone cross. And the family, in turn, became unwitting accomplices in this pact of silence. They wove their lives around Samuel's void, learning not to ask the questions whose answers he so clearly could not give. It wasn't from a lack of curiosity or love, but the opposite. It was a conspiracy of tenderness, an unspoken agreement to protect a man they loved from demons they couldn't name. They celebrated holidays, marked milestones, and told stories. But the greatest chapter of their patriarch's life remained a closed book, untouched on the highest shelf. This legacy of silence was passed down through the generations. Samuel's wife learned to love the man who returned, not the boy who left. His children learned to respect their father's quietude, and David, the grandson, inherited the question, the mystery that became as intrinsic a part of his grandfather as the color of his eyes. They were protecting him from his past, but in doing so, perhaps they left him terribly alone in his grief. The shattering of this 70-year pact was not an act of will, but of surrender. It happened in the sterility of a hospital room, where the only sound was the rhythmic beep of a machine counting down the final moments of a long life. Samuel, who had grown almost entirely non-communicative, a ship adrift in the fog at the end of life, suddenly showed a flash of clarity. His eyes, once clouded, focused with a shocking intensity, but they weren't seeing the room, nor the family gathered around him. They were seeing a distant place, a memory that had fought its way to the surface at the last possible moment. A tremor ran through his frail frame, one final effort to give voice to the ghost that had haunted his entire life. He leaned forward, a nearly imperceptible movement, and his chapped lips parted. The sound that emerged was no louder than the rustle of dry leaves, but it filled the room with the weight of thunder. Leah, the name hung in the sterile air, an anomaly, a syllable freighted with the weight of decades of repression. To the family, It was a meaningless sound, an unknown name. But to David, who was holding his grandfather's hand, the word was like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. In that instant, Samuel's silence was no longer a void. It became a mystery with a name. A moment later, the heart monitor issued one long, continuous tone, and Samuel was gone. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a silence of absence, but one of questioning. As grief enveloped the room, a new emotion took hold of David, a fierce, unshakable resolve. To the world, Samuel's story had ended, but for David, the real story, the one that mattered, had just begun. He would make a silent promise to the man he'd just lost. He would find out who Leah was, or spend the rest of his life haunted by the same ghost that had taken his grandfather. To find the root of a 70-year silence, you must travel back in time to a place where sound still existed. You have to go back before the scar to understand the unbroken skin. Before the war, Samuel wasn't a ghost haunted by memories. He was a promise of a life, vibrant with the boundless energy of youth in small-town Ohio. His world smelled of fresh-cut grass and motor oil, and his universe revolved around a twin axis: old cars to fix and the dreams he shared with his best friend, Michael. They weren't merely friends, they were a brotherhood forged in the fire of adolescence, two halves of the same ambitious soul. They were inseparable, bound by inside jokes, grand plans for the future, and the unshakable belief that the world was an open map waiting for them to chart their course. In that golden era, the war was an abstract concept, a distant crackle on the radio that couldn't penetrate the bubble of their youthful invincibility. The future wasn't something to be survived, but a horizon to be conquered, and they planned to conquer it side by side. That bubble of innocence wasn't popped, it was shattered. The news of Pearl Harbor came not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap that cracked the very foundations of their world. Overnight, the sleepy tranquility of their town was replaced by a fever of patriotism, fear, and a righteous anger that spread like wildfire. The boys who once competed on baseball diamonds were now lining up at recruitment stations, their young faces hardened with a grim determination. For Samuel and Michael, there was no hesitation. The call to duty wasn't a question, but a command from within. To protect the world they knew, the families they loved, the very freedom to dream became the only priority. The farewell at the train station was a rite of passage, a chaotic blur of steam, choked-back tears, and identical uniforms. Amid the crowd on the teeming platform, they made the pact that would define their lives. It wasn't a promise of heroism, but something far more fundamental. With a heavy hand on Samuel's shoulder, Michael looked him in the eye and spoke the words that would become their anchor. "We come home, Sam. Together, no matter what." It was in the sterile environment of basic training, far from the comforts of home, that the true stakes of that promise were revealed. Between the grueling drills and the homesick nights, Michael shared the most vulnerable part of his soul with Samuel. With reverent hands, he pulled a worn photograph from his wallet, its edges soft from countless touches. The image was of a young woman, her smile so radiant it seemed to defy the faded black and white of the photograph. "This is Leah," Michael said, his voice usually full of youthful bravado, now soft with a tenderness Samuel had rarely heard. She was French, a student he'd met on a trip before the world went mad. Theirs was a fledgling romance, interrupted by war, but kept alive in letters that crossed a dangerous ocean. Leah wasn't just a girl. She was the embodiment of a world at peace, a symbol of the life that waited for them on the other side of the coming inferno. Leah became an almost mystical presence in the two friends' lives. Her letters, written on thin, scented paper, became their shared talisman. In moments of fear and doubt, Michael would read them aloud to Samuel, her words a bridge to a future where the sound of guns would be replaced by laughter and music. She wrote of art, of philosophy, and of the resilience of the human spirit, never of the war. To Samuel, who didn't know her, Leah became more than his friend's love. She was proof that beauty, intelligence, and kindness still existed. She was the reason they were fighting, not in an abstract, patriotic sense, but in a deeply personal one. She represented the after, the promise that their souls, however wounded, would have a place to return and heal. Her safety and Michael's reunion with her became a mission intertwined with their very survival. On the night before they shipped out to Europe, the air thick with a silent tension and unspoken fear, Michael made one final request of Samuel, a promise that added a new and terrible layer to the pact they had already made. In the dim light of their barracks, he handed Samuel not just the photograph of Leia, but also the last letter he had received from her, carefully folded. "If something happens to me, Sam," he began, his voice low and steady, devoid of any drama, which made it all the heavier. "You find her. Don't leave her waiting in the dark for news that will never come. You give this letter to her. You tell her my last thought was of her. You tell her I loved her." He pressed the items into Samuel's hand. The photograph, which once felt so light, now seemed to have the weight of lead. Samuel looked at the smiling face of Leia, then into the serious eyes of his brother. He didn't have to think. The answer was the only one possible. "I promise," Samuel said, a simple, two-word pledge, made in the dark of uncertainty, with no idea its weight would follow him for 70 years, shaping every silent day yet to come. There are names in history that are whispered with a kind of grim reverence, names that have become synonymous not with glory, but with suffering. The Hurtgen Forest is one of those names. For the soldiers who entered its dark, damp embrace in late 1944, it wasn't a battlefield. It was the green hell, a sentient labyrinth designed to break bodies and disintegrate the soul. The tall, dense trees formed a canopy that blotted out the sun, plunging the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. The ground was a treacherous mire of freezing mud, hidden roots, and sullied snow. War here wasn't fought in advances and retreats, but in yards of desperation, from one shattered tree to the next. The promise Samuel and Michael made on a sunlit train platform in Ohio was being tested in a place where the sun couldn't reach, and where promises died as frequently as men. Every artillery blast, which sounded like the cracking of giant bones, was a cruel reminder of the fragility of their pact. Trauma is rarely a prolonged event. It is often a single moment, a frozen instant in time that shatters, its shards lodging themselves permanently in the memory. For Samuel, that instant arrived under the deafening shriek of a German artillery barrage, a tactic designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. The world was reduced to a primal sensory overload. The air vibrated with the sound of incoming shells, followed by explosions that made the ground heave violently, ripping trees out by their roots and sending a deadly rain of dirt, rock, and metal shrapnel. Survival instinct took over, a blind force that screamed to dig into the earth, to make oneself small, to disappear. In the chaos, their unit was scattered. There was no formation, no strategy, just isolated men fighting for their individual lives, each one diving into whatever ditch or foxhole might offer a split second of shelter. Samuel found himself pressed against the wet ground, heart hammering against his ribs, every breath a stolen luxury. When the cacophony finally ceased, the silence that followed was an entity of its own, heavier and more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a sacred and profane silence, filled with the absence of those who were there just moments before. The smell of cordite and ozone hung heavy in the freezing air. Slowly, like a man clawing his way out of a grave, Samuel pushed himself up. His body was intact, but his hearing was a sharp, steady ringing. The first feeling was relief, the animalistic, selfish gratitude of simply being alive, but that feeling was immediately annihilated by a second, more powerful one, a cold dread. Michael. Where was Michael? He began to call his friend's name, his raw voice sounding shockingly loud in the forest's deadly quiet. The name echoed among the mutilated trees, but the only reply was the drip of melting snow from broken branches. Panic began to set in, a cold wave that was worse than the forest chill. The search was a desperate blur. Samuel stumbled through the nightmarish landscape, the forest floor unrecognizable, churned up and smoking as if some angry god had plowed it. He called Michael's name over and over, the word becoming a prayer, a plea. He found him not far away, partially pinned by the wreckage of a massive pine tree whose base had been obliterated. Michael was alive, but only just. His eyes, usually so full of life and humor, were clouded with pain, but they focused on Samuel as he approached. In that moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was no war, no forest, only the two brothers, lying on the cold ground. Samuel took Michael's hand, feeling the faint, thready pulse. There was no time for medics, no time for words of comfort that would ring as hollow lies. There was only time for the truth. With an effort that cost Michael the last of his life force, he tried to speak. His voice was a gurgling, blood-flecked whisper, but his words were clear. "The letter," he gasped, his eyes pleading with Samuel to understand. "My pocket, for Leah." He didn't have to say more. The promise. The final promise. Michael's hand tightened on Samuel's with surprising strength, one last act of will before it went completely slack. And then the silence. In the gloom of that cursed forest, as snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in a white shroud, Samuel knelt beside his brother's body. He was alone, and yet he was not. He was with the weight of two promises, one to live and one to deliver news that would shatter a heart an ocean away. With trembling fingers, he reached into Michael's uniform pocket and pulled out the stained letter. The real battle, the one that would be fought in the quiet of his own soul for the next 70 years, had just begun. The man who stepped off that train in Ohio was not the same one who had boarded it. Physically, he was whole, a miracle in itself, but his soul had returned in fragments, riddled with shrapnel from the dark forest that he would never be able to remove. His family received him with tears of joy and relief, embracing a body that was present but unfeeling of the spirit that inhabited it. There was a new stillness about Samuel, a quiet that was not of peace, but of profound exhaustion. His eyes, which had once shone with the dreams of a shared future, now seemed like frosted glass, reflecting the world without truly seeing it. He smiled at the right moments, answered questions in monosyllables, and went through the rituals of his return. But he was operating like a well-trained automaton. He was a ghost at his own welcome home party, a spectator to his own life, his mind perpetually thousands of miles away, kneeling in the frozen mud beside his brother's body. The trauma hadn't left him on the battlefield. He had brought it home, a silent, clandestine passenger that would live with him forever. In the days that followed, before the silence solidified into a permanent feature, there was a final ritual. One night, alone in the bedroom he had once shared with his brother, Samuel opened his military footlocker. With the slow, deliberate precision of a man defusing a bomb, he removed the artifacts from his other life. The uniform, still smelling of mildew and fear. The medals, whose gleam felt like a mockery. And finally, the two heaviest items, the worn photograph of Leah and the blood-stained letter from Michael. He laid his brother's letter on the desk, and next to it, a blank sheet of paper. He picked up a pen, the promise to Michael echoing in his ears. He tried to write. He tried to form the words that would be a death sentence to the hope of a woman he had never met. But his hands trembled, and his mind rebelled. How could he be the harbinger of such devastation? How could his return to life mean the end of hers? Survivor's guilt paralyzed him. Protecting Leah from the truth became, in his traumatized mind, a duty greater than the promise he had made. With a sigh of defeat, he took Michael's letter, Leah's photograph, and his own unfinished note, placed them back in the footlocker, and closed the lid. It was a click that sealed not just the wood, but his fate. Life went on, as life stubbornly does. Samuel married a good, kind woman whom he loved with what capacity he had left. They built a home, had children, and by all outward appearances lived the American dream he and Michael had once planned. But a ghost sat at their dinner table every night. The ghost of Michael, the ghost of Leah, the ghost of the unfulfilled promise. Samuel would watch his own children take their first steps, learn to ride a bike, graduate from school, and in every one of these happy milestones, there was a pang of pain. This was the life Michael was supposed to have. These were the joys he had stolen. He loved his children with a protective fierceness, but always from a slight distance. as if afraid his own damaged soul might somehow contaminate their innocence. He was a present father, but an absent spirit. His love filtered through a thick layer of unresolved grief and guilt. As the years turned into decades, Samuel's silence became an institution. It ceased being a phase and became a core part of his identity. He was the quiet hero, the man of few words, labels the community gave him respectfully, never knowing that each one was a knife twisting slowly in his soul's wound. He became a master of deflection, an expert at changing the subject, an architect of impenetrable emotional walls. The letter and the photograph remained in the footlocker, an emotional time bomb whose ticking only he could hear. The need to fulfill his promise warred constantly with the paralyzing fear of causing pain, until, over time, silence won. It wasn't a clean victory, but a war of attrition that lasted decades, leaving him exhausted and isolated on an island of his own making. He buried the story so deep he almost convinced himself it had died. But memory is a stubborn thing. It does not die. It merely waits. And for 70 years, the name Leah waited. It waited through a marriage, the birth of children and grandchildren, through decades of a changing world. It waited, dormant, in the locked vault of Samuel's mind. He had built an entire life on the foundation of that silence, a good life, but an incomplete one. He had protected everyone around him from the truth, but in doing so, he ensured that the original wound could never possibly heal. The broken promise became the compass of his life, always pointing to the due north of his perceived failure. He never knew that the true impact of his decision wouldn't end with him. He couldn't imagine that in the final moment of his life, the dam would finally break, and the name he spent a lifetime silencing would become the starting point for a new search. His grandson's quest for the truth. The name Leah, whispered into the silence of a hospital room, wasn't just a word. It was a key. For David, who had spent his entire life orbiting the black hole of his grandfather's past, that name was the first tangible light to ever penetrate the darkness. It became a quiet obsession, an echo that resonated in his thoughts as he went through the rituals of grief, shaking hands with relatives and listening to stories about the Samuel everyone knew. But David now knew there was another Samuel, a secret Samuel, and the journey to find him began in the only place it could, the dusty attic of his grandparents' house. The attic was a museum of lives lived, cluttered with the detritus of decades, sheet-covered furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, stacks of old magazines. It was a labyrinth of forgotten memories, and at its center, like an altar in a forgotten tomb, was the object David always knew existed, but was never allowed to touch: a dark, wooden military footlocker. That footlocker was a family legend. To the children, it was a forbidden treasure chest. To the adults, it was simply Grandpa's things, an object as permanent and unapproachable as the man himself. To approach it now felt like a transgression, a violation of a sanctuary. The air around it seemed thicker, charged with the energy of locked-away emotions. With his heart hammering in his chest, a mix of reverence and feverish anticipation, David ran his fingers over the dust-caked lid. The lock was rusted and stiff, a stubborn guardian of old secrets. Using the tip of a screwdriver from his grandfather's toolshed, he pried the mechanism open. The sound of the metal giving way was shockingly loud in the silence, a shriek of protest at being disturbed after 70 years. With a breath caught in his throat, David lifted the heavy lid. The scent that rose to meet him was the smell of time itself, mothballs, old wool, and the faint, dry aroma of aging paper. The first layer inside the footlocker was predictable, almost mundane. A U.S. Army uniform, folded with a precision that had survived decades, the olive-drab fabric now stiff with age, a helmet, a pair of worn-out boots. But beneath this layer of military history, the real treasure lay in wait. David's fingers brushed against a small leather object. He pulled it into the dim attic light. It was a diary, its cover worn and supple from handling. Opening it, he recognized his grandfather's script, but it was a young man's handwriting, full of loops and energy. The pages detailed the boredom and camaraderie of basic training, peppered with the name Michael. David read of jokes, of dreams, and of the unshakable promise the two friends shared. And tucked between 2 pages like a sacred bookmark, he found it. A small photograph with worn edges, the portrait of a young woman with eyes that seemed to smile right at him, even through the veil of time. On the back, in faded cursive, was a single name, Leah. Hope surged in David's chest, a wave of warmth that caught him by surprise. There she was, no longer a ghost, but a face. He felt an immediate connection, not to the woman, but to the mystery. This was the source of the 70-year silence. But as he thumbed through the rest of the diary, the story took a turn he didn't expect. The last entries were nearly illegible, scrawled with a feverish urgency that spoke of fear and chaos. They spoke of the Hürtgen forest, of artillery, of loss. The very last entry was a single, stark sentence, written with such force it nearly tore the paper. "He's gone. Mike is gone." David's hope faltered, replaced by a growing confusion. He had thought Leah was his grandfather's secret, but maybe she was someone else's secret, one his grandfather had inherited on that terrible day in the forest. The search hadn't ended with finding the photo. It had only deepened. At the bottom of the footlocker beneath the diary, there was more. 2 envelopes. The first was sealed, the paper darkened and stained by something that looked as ancient as the earth itself. It was addressed to Mademoiselle Leah Dubois in Paris, France. The handwriting was not Samuel's. It was looser, more confident. It was Michael's letter. Beside it, there was a second unsealed envelope with the name Leah written on the front in Samuel's own hand. And inside the footlocker, lying loose, was a single sheet of paper, his grandfather's attempted letter that he never finished, never sent. David's new hope now had a physical form. 2 envelopes and a photograph. They were the 3 pieces of an emotional puzzle. The key to his grandfather's silence was right there, in his hands, and he knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that when he read the contents of Michael's letter, he would no longer be just observing the past. He would be stepping inside it. There was a sacredness to the act, a sense of crossing a threshold that David felt in every fiber of his being. To hold Michael's sealed letter was to hold a time capsule of pure emotion, a message that had never reached its destination. For a moment he hesitated, the weight of that posthumous privacy paralyzing him. This letter was not meant for him. It was an intimate dialogue frozen in time. A young man's soul distilled into ink on paper. But the image of his grandfather's face on his deathbed, the agony in his final whisper, propelled David forward. He wasn't violating a confidence. He was trying to understand the burden that had shattered his own grandfather's spirit. With a care that bordered on reverence, using the blade of a pocket knife so as not to tear the fragile paper, he opened the envelope. The letter inside was perfectly preserved, as if time itself hadn't dared to touch the words within. The voice that emerged from the page was not that of a soldier, but of a poet. Michael wrote to Leah not of the war, the mud, or the fear, but of the future they would build together. He painted it for her with words, describing in vivid detail the small house they would have, the porch swing where they would sit on summer nights, the children they would have whose laughter would fill the rooms. He described life in Ohio with such longing and love that he made it a mythical paradise, a Garden of Eden waiting for them on the other side of this temporary hell. It was a letter of pure hope, a refusal to let the darkness of the present extinguish the light of their future. Every sentence was an affirmation of life, a promise that he would return to her, not as a hero, but as the man who loved her. David felt a lump form in his throat, reading the words of a man who was, unknowingly, writing his own epitaph. In the middle of the letter, the tone shifted slightly, and it was here that David's puzzle gained a new, crucial piece. Michael began to write about Samuel. "You're going to love Sam," he wrote to Leah. "He has a quiet soul, but it's the most loyal soul I've ever known. He's more my brother than anyone born of my mother. When this madness is over, it'll be the 3 of us against the world. He'll be the godfather to our first son, and we'll teach him how to laugh a little louder." He described their friendship not in terms of bravery or battle-forged camaraderie, but in terms of a deep, spiritual connection. He wrote of the promise they made to come home together, presenting it not as a hopeful wish, but as an inevitable fact. Reading these words, David began to understand the magnitude of his grandfather's loss. He hadn't just lost a friend in the Hurtgen forest. He had lost a piece of himself, the other pillar upon which his entire future was meant to be built. The revelation was like a light being switched on in a dark room, illuminating things in a new, painful way. Leah wasn't a romantic secret Samuel had hidden. She was his brother's legacy. She was the recipient of a sacred promise. The question that had haunted David shifted. It was no longer, who was Leah, but a much darker, more complex question. Why did my grandfather break his promise? Why would a man described by Michael himself as the most loyal soul failed to carry out his dying brother's last wish? Why would he allow this letter of hope and love to rot in a footlocker for 70 years, leaving the woman Michael loved waiting in the dark, exactly as he had promised he would not? Survivor's guilt, which David had always assumed was the source of his grandfather's silence, now seemed like too simple an explanation. There was something more, a deeper layer of pain or fear that stopped him from closing that circle. David put down Michael's letter and picked up his grandfather's own unfinished sheet of paper. He read it again, but this time the words resonated with a different weight. How can I send a letter that will destroy your world? How can I be the bearer of darkness? It was not the voice of a man afraid to face the past. It was the voice of a man afraid of destroying someone else's future. Samuel wasn't protecting himself. He was trying to protect Leah. In that moment, paralyzed by grief, he made an impossible choice. He chose silence over being the harbinger of death. The emotional reconstruction of his grandfather's story was proving to be more tragic than he could have ever imagined. The silence was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of misguided compassion, a burden he chose to carry alone, to spare a stranger the pain that was consuming him. And that choice had condemned him to a lifetime of silent loneliness. The attic, which had once been the epicenter of the mystery, now felt too small to contain David's questions. He had the pieces: Michael's letter, Leah's photo, his grandfather's unfinished confession, but they formed the image of a tragedy, not a resolution. The truth was no longer contained in that footlocker. It was somewhere across an ocean, in Paris, perhaps still waiting. The need to understand why his grandfather had made that paralyzing choice became a driving force. It was no longer enough to comprehend Samuel's pain. David felt an overwhelming responsibility to somehow, in some way, close the circle his grandfather could not. He had to confront the ghost of Leah, not for himself, but for his grandfather and the brother he lost. The quest ceased to be about Samuel's past and became about the future of his memory. He had to try, 70 years later, to fulfill the promise his grandfather couldn't. The beginning of the search was frustratingly modern and impersonal. David, a man from Ohio, began his journey to 1940s Paris on the glowing screen of his laptop. He typed the name Leah Dubois into search engines, into online archives, into genealogy forums. The name was common, and the records from the war era were chaotic and incomplete. He spent weeks in a digital dead end, feeling the same helpless frustration his grandfather must have felt. But the image of Leah's smiling face haunted him. She wasn't a name on a list. She was a real person whose life was irrevocably altered by a moment of violence in a faraway forest. Driven by a gut feeling he couldn't explain, David booked a flight to Paris. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he wouldn't find it in his living room. He took the originals with him, the photo and the 2 letters, sacred artifacts on his pilgrimage. Paris was a city of overwhelming beauty, but David didn't see it as a tourist. He walked its streets not admiring the architecture, but trying to imagine it as Leah would have, first as a student full of dreams, then under the shadow of occupation. The address on Michael's envelope was for an apartment building in the Latin Quarter, one that was still standing, a silent witness to decades of history. Standing outside, looking up at the windows, David felt a tangible connection to the past, a chill running down his spine. He spent days in city archives, libraries, and parish registries, his search hampered by the language barrier and the passage of time. The trail was cold, nearly frozen. Frustration began to curdle into despair. Maybe his grandfather had been right. Maybe some stories weren't meant to be unearthed. The breakthrough came not from an official record, but from an unexpected source. In a small, dusty bookshop near the Sorbonne, David, on a whim, showed the photograph of Leah to the old, white-haired proprietor. The man peered at the photo, his eyes narrowing in recognition. He didn't know Leah Dubois, but he knew the photographer. On the back of the original photo, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny studio stamp. It was from a photographer well known in the neighborhood before and after the war, a man who documented student life. That photographer was long dead, but his archive, his meticulous record of faces and names, had been donated to a small local historical museum. It was there, in a dusty ledger book, that David found the confrontation he was looking for. Next to a copy of Leah's photo was a notation: Leah Dubois, married Luc Fournier, 1946, moved to Lyon. The final reunion was not with Leah, but with her legacy. In a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Lyon, under the shade of an old oak tree, David found the headstone. Leah Fournier, née Dubois. She had lived a long life, passing away only a few years prior in her late 80s. She'd had children and grandchildren. She had survived the war, married, built a family. She had lived. The wave of emotions that hit David was complex and overwhelming. There was sadness that he had never met her, that he had arrived too late. But predominantly, there was a sense of profound, bittersweet peace. His grandfather's silence, his act of misguided compassion had, in its own way, worked. He hadn't contacted her, and she had moved on, building a new life from the ashes of the old. He had spared her the pain of Michael's letter, but at what cost to himself? Standing before that cold stone, David finally understood the full, crushing weight of his grandfather's burden. He didn't break his promise out of weakness, but out of a tragic strength, choosing to carry the grief of two men so that she could live in peace. Standing in that cemetery in Lyon, David's geographical journey had reached its end, but his true destination was still to be reached. The confrontation with the past had resulted not in a dramatic reunion, but in a quiet, profound revelation etched in stone. Leah had lived a full life. She had found love again, had a family. The image Samuel had guarded, that of a heartbroken young woman waiting eternally for news that never came, was not the reality. Life, with its relentless tenacity, had moved forward. This discovery did not diminish his grandfather's sacrifice. On the contrary, it cast it in even sharper, more poignant relief. Samuel had sentenced himself to a lifetime of silence to protect a woman who, in the end, proved to have the strength to heal herself. He carried his burden in isolation, never knowing that the person he was trying to shield had already found her own way out of the darkness. The journey home was different. The Atlantic no longer felt like a barrier, but a bridge between two stories. When David stepped back into his grandfather's attic, the space no longer felt haunted. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was filled with a new understanding. He opened the military footlocker, but this time not as a detective hunting for clues, but as a keeper of memory. He took out Michael's letter, the letter of hope and dreams, and his grandfather's own unfinished letter, the confession of pain and compassion. He saw them now not as evidence of failure, but as testaments to a profound love, the love of a young man for a woman he would never see again, and the love of a brother who was willing to sacrifice his own peace to honor his friend's memory. David's final act was not grand, but it was the only one that mattered. He took Michael's letter, and for the first time in over 70 years, it served its purpose. He brought it down to the living room fireplace, the same spot where his grandfather had sat in his silence. With a single match, he touched the flame to the corner of the paper. He wasn't destroying the letter. He was releasing it. He watched as Michael's words of love and hope turned to smoke, rising up the chimney and joining the sky, a message finally delivered to the universe. It was a symbolic funeral, a letting go of the promise that had weighed on his family's soul for so long. In doing so, David wasn't erasing the story, he was completing it. He was offering the forgiveness his grandfather could never ask for and the peace that Michael deserved. Samuel's redemption wasn't in a battle won or a medal earned. It was here, in the understanding of his grandson. The legacy Samuel left was not one of shame and silence, but of a fallible humanity and a love so profound it led him to make an impossible choice. The emotional inheritance was finally restored. The silence was broken and replaced with a story of sacrifice, grief, and the extraordinary resilience of the human heart. David could now look at his grandfather's portrait and see not a broken hero, but a whole man, whose greatest battle was fought and won in the quiet of his own soul. He no longer had to wonder about the void in his grandfather's eyes. He now understood the depths of what lay there. The house was no longer filled with silence. It was filled with peace. The journey that began with a whispered word, Leah, had ended with an act of liberation. David, in unraveling his grandfather's past, had found his own path to reconciliation. He learned that some wounds are so deep they never fully close, but that love and understanding can cleanse the infection, allowing life to grow around them. The story of Samuel and Michael and Leah was no longer a secret locked in a trunk, but a legacy of compassion to be remembered and honored. The weight had been lifted. The ghost could finally rest. David's journey into the heart of his grandfather's silence unearthed not shame, but a profound grief and an unshakable love. The name Leah, once a mystery, became the symbol for the legacy of a generation that carried invisible wounds. By understanding the story his grandfather couldn't tell, David finally brought peace to his memory and freed himself from the emptiness of the unanswered question. Samuel's story wasn't about what he hid, but about the extraordinary strength it takes to survive carrying the weight of a ghost. His greatest battle wasn't fought in any forest in Europe, but in the quiet of his own soul, a battle that lasted 70 years. And if you were on that battlefield, what would you have left behind? If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments if you've experienced something similar. If you know someone who went through this, or what this story made you feel, your voice could heal someone today.